Good afternoon and welcome to Work Where To From Here, the fifth in this six-part webinar series. It's wonderful to welcome you. I'm Tara Diamond from AMA and your facilitator for the series that's been developed for you by AMA, Australian Resource and Energy Group, and Compass Group. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this meeting is initiated on the traditional lands of the Turrbal Nation. On behalf of all participants, I pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging of the Meanjin people, the traditional owners of the lands in which you join the gathering from as well. I'd like to also acknowledge that today is Wear It Purple Day, and Wear It Purple strives to foster supportive, safe, empowering and inclusive environments for rainbow young people. Today is Wear It Purple's 10th year anniversary, and I know there's lots of activities across the resource and energy industry today celebrating Wear It Purple and supporting our industry's LGBTQI young people. So the format for the webinar, for those of you that have been listening for the last few weeks, is interactive. So please use the question function on the webinar control panel to ask questions at any time of the session, and I'll do my best to get to as many as possible. Our fantastic speaker today will be introduced by Brett Craig, Executive Director of Compass Group. And for those of you that don't know Compass Group, they're the world's largest provider of food services and one of the top 10 largest employers globally. Brett's role within Compass Groups Australia has operations in food services, camp and facilities management, and a range of other services that covers over 500 sites with a workforce of 11,000 people. And in the resources and energy industry, Compass Group and ESS covers 106 offshore and remote locations with a workforce of 2,500 people. And Compass Group, like your organisations, has had to adapt and change to the impacts and changes to work and workforces due to COVID-19. So I'll now invite Brett to introduce and interview our guest speaker. Brett, thank you so much, Brett.
Thank you very much, Tara, and welcome everybody to our second last session of what's been an amazing series. So look, over the last few weeks, we've really looked at the new world from the perspective of our teams or employees, with discussions on mental health, resilience, and virtual offices. So we're going to change things up a little bit and look at the impact of organisational culture and purpose during a crisis. Now, I'm really excited about this one, not just because we have the amazing Jennie with us today, but because this is something that I'm personally passionate about too. So firstly, something a little bit about Jennie. So Jennie McLaughlin is Oceania Purpose and Customer Leader at renowned advisory firm Ernst & Young. In this role, Jennie focuses on highlighting the power of purpose-led leadership and the positive impact it has on employees, customers, and indeed the bottom line. She inspires people in organisations of all sizes, big and small, local and global, to become purpose-led leaders. The leadership style is not a passing fad. Jennie knows it's only the way to achieve happy and empowered employees along with great people, customer, and financial outcomes. Prior to joining EY, she honed her customer experience skills through a real-world experience as the head customer of Office Business and various sales and marketing executive roles. She's also one of only 17 customer experience professionals in Australia, and is also an active member of the Customer Experience Professional Association in Australia. So welcome, Jennie, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Brett.
No worries. Now, Jennie, look, I know even from a Compass perspective that the COVID crisis created a very singular focus in terms of leadership that drove a very different leadership culture that was both adaptive, flexible, and decisive. I guess in many ways, this is what you mean by purpose. It's that alignment of views and very specific focus on a great future state. So I guess the question is, and what we're hoping you're going to share with us today, is all about how we make that enduring and the impact of purpose has in challenging times like we have today.
Exactly, Brett. And I'm going to try and do this justice in some storytelling, which is a really important part of purpose-led leadership. But before I start, I wanted to just say to you, both you and Tara, how grateful I am for this opportunity. You know, this is absolutely living my purpose, which is behind me on the wall. But, you know, it's all about imparting, you know, some stories that are powerful in their own right to help guide you on your own purpose journey. But I wanted to just say, wherever you're dialing in from, wherever you are, I hope you're safe and well, and I hope you're mentally hanging in there. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, where it has been actually pretty tough, you know, in this second phase of lockdown. And we're having to all dig really deep into our own resilience reserves to get through. But what I, you know, maybe as a parting, sort of an opening comment, I'd say that, you're probably all getting a sense of, in a crisis, that in a very personal way, we're all searching for some sort of deeper meaning. We instinctively know that that's where strength lies. And in the context of an organisation, it's exactly the same. When your business context is thrown upside down in the space of months, you really start to go back to what is the core reason for being, what's your why of your organisation, and how do you get that clarity to push through. It's not the time where you're going to be thinking about, are we going to meet our targets, and you know, saying to everyone, push through guys, let's keep the sales going, these are important. That is important, but it's how you do it. How do you inspire your workforce to tap into that inner strength and find that clarity to push through? So, you know, since the start of COVID, I've had the utter privilege to work with a lot of leaders to help navigate through COVID and you know, just work with them on what that means from their context. And I wanted to just say on the outset that I think there are broadly 3 categories of leaders that I've observed through the lens of purpose. The first is those leaders who, going into COVID, had a really clear why. They knew exactly what the broader and more noble purpose of their organisation was. And they had some really clear lived values. And so as a result, when COVID hit, they were able to simply, you know, keep true to those and make decisions quickly and swiftly, keeping their people safe and making the necessary decisions. The second category of leaders are those that maybe had a purpose statement or have a purpose statement and a set of values, but metaphorically they've been gathering a bit of dust, and they realised pretty quickly that they needed to dust them off and put those values and why front and centre. And then I think the third category of leaders are those who didn't have a clear organisational purpose. It might have been very internally oriented, like to be the biggest or the best or to hit these revenue targets. And as a result, they're really struggling with something to anchor their decision making to through these times. So, you know, if you think about yourself as a leader or your organisation, you know, which category would you honestly put yourself into in your organisation? And I'd say if it's in those latter 2 categories, hopefully what I can do today is give you some inspiration to move into that first category. Because, you know, if I compare and contrast those leaders who are doing well and making good decisions in the crisis, it really is very much those in the first category. And I'm sure that as a consumer in your own right, you will see those decisions that big organisations are making. And some of them you'll go, yeah, that's absolutely the right thing to do. And others you'll think, don't know about that. What were they thinking? So I think purpose has a lot to do with whether they're making those decisions, you know, from the right lens. So let's get straight into some stories, and I'm going to share 4, and then we'll pass back to you. I'd love to know what kind of questions you have. And by just way of introduction, I'm not saying that these are perfect organisations or perfect leaders by any stretch, but what I am saying is that I know these leaders to be very, very oriented by their purpose and their set of values. And what I'm seeing is through a crisis, these things are coming out. They're coming front and centre. So the first organisation is Atlassian. I'm sure it needs no introduction. Since it was founded by Mike and Scott back in 2002, it has been an organisation that has been rock solid on its values. And you'll probably laugh if you see some of these values up on the screen. These are cut and paste directly from the Atlassian site. If you haven't seen them before, you'll notice they're quite colourful. Not your typical respect, honesty, and you know, those sort of values. Quite lively and very lived in the way they're expressed. So thinking about these values and the purpose of Atlassian to help unleash the potential of every team. We've seen Atlassian's behaviour, and I'd really encourage you to go and have a look at some of the news releases on Atlassian since sort of March. They have been the first to move in many situations through COVID. They had announced their remote working for all their team. They were one of the first out of the gate. And they set up a really informal, frequent cadence around their communications from the top down, making sure that their people felt connected, understood what the plan was, and just really being part of the fabric, regardless of whether they were in the office or not. The other thing they did that was, I think, really true to their values was made sure the communications was two-way. Because quite often we can feel that now is the time to blast out lots of town halls, let's get people in and let's tell them. But actually what you want to do is create a really effective, feedback loop between your front line. So within just a couple of weeks of sending their people home, what they actually did was they did a survey and they said, how is it going for you? What's working, what's not working? And two really pertinent things that came back from that survey was that their employees were not set up at home well. They were ill-equipped to work from home. They didn't have studies, they may not have had desks, they may not have even had the right chairs. So that was a really big issue for them. And the second issue was those that had kids were not doing well. As those of you who I know, I've got children 10 and 12, so not too young, but it's really tricky with homeschooling and not being able to use childcare. So those two categories stood out loud and clear. So what did Atlassian do? Well, the first thing they did was they gave everyone $500 to actually help them get their office environment set up correctly. And then what they did is they made it very clear that for those who had young kids, they had a whole lot of flexible working options. They were able to take some extended leave, etc. And then they pulsed them again a couple of weeks later and saw that that had made all the difference in the world. Those issues had gone away and people were now set up for success at home. They also understood that as the weeks went by that they needed to think about broader social things. So they set up team walking, team yoga classes, etc., to keep that social fabric together, to keep that culture, not all about getting the job done, but actually about being there and actually experiencing each other's company, albeit remotely. So these are just a couple of examples that, they've taken over the period of COVID. But I think one of the really interesting ones is that they also announced now that they're happy for working at home to become a permanent feature. So if you're comfortable with that as an employee, you can do that even past COVID. And they're one of the first organisations to do so. So every step of the way, they've been driven by their purpose and their values, and they didn't need a committee. They didn't need to think about whether this was the right thing to do. That feedback loop has helped guide them along the way. And then just to top it off, if any of this is something that you want to know more about, go to the Atlassian site, and every time they do something, they actually give it out to the world to share. So you'll find things like their employee survey. You can download the entire survey so you can use it, pick it up and use it in your organisation. They've talked about these team social events that they've done. That's all fully documented for you to download and use in your organisation. And then from a customer's point of view, they've actually made some of their core software free and available through the period of COVID so people can get their own remote working up and running. And for teachers, they've actually provided their teacher software available free so that teachers making the transition to remote working are able to do that with the best tools at their hand. So some really rich examples there, but a great company that had a great purpose and good values and has simply just taken those into the crisis and dialed them up even further. So let's look at the second example. And this one here is, one that I've admired for a long time from a distance in the context of a purpose-led leader. Unilever came up with this purpose to make sustainable living commonplace way back in 2010 with a phenomenal leader by the name of Paul Polman. And he's been working really hard in his organisation to make some significant changes to align everything that Unilever does from top to tail towards this purpose and big idea of actually making sustainable living commonplace. They've done things like halving the amount of packaging across 410 products, making their entire extended value chain and supply chain more sustainable, and many, many more things. But in terms of what they've actually done through COVID, their new CEO by the name of Alan Jope actually realised very quickly, weeks into this crisis, that it was going to be a biggie, were his words. And he needed to really act swiftly and think about what can Unilever do with its size and scale and reach to really make a difference. And one of the things he did very early off the cuff was he realised that the supply chain that supplies into Unilever was full of mums and dads, was full of low paying, employees and extended workers. And he realised that cash flow was going to be very, very critical for those organisations to get through the crisis. So what he offered was $500 million of cash flow relief to the extended supply chain so that they didn't have to worry about whether or not that was going to, break their business. And having that sort of put on top of them was enabled them to make some really good decisions and not worry about do they have to lay off staff, to be able to keep their businesses operating and viable through that period. So that was a really significant gesture that they offered out to their supply chain. The other thing he did was very early, he encouraged his leadership team and all of his employees to brainstorm down in the local communities that they worked in. What was required? What in the context of that country or community was really needed? Was it food donations that they needed? Was it knowledge? Was it skills? Was it even just small acts of kindness? And through doing this and getting close to the front end, they were able to make a number of really innovative and volunteering gestures to the communities in which they operated. And then lastly, and very importantly, in terms of their workforce, they just went out there and said, you're safe. We're actually providing you with up to 3 months' salary if you get COVID and you're unable to come into work, or whatever happens in your local country prevents you from being able to come into your place of work. Again, just giving that psychological safety to their employees to, you know, attend to probably more stressful things going on in their context and just have that feeling that Unilever was behind them, having their back. Now, notwithstanding these two examples that I've used, both Atlassian and Unilever, it's probably fair to say we're on the positive side of this disruption. So Atlassian have had more demand for their software products, and Unilever, who make bleach and sanitizer and soap, have obviously had more demand. In fact, offering $100 million of donations into it. So let me just maybe flip to two other stories, which are the other side of that coin. So what happens when it doesn't go so well, or you're at the negative end of the impact of COVID? So the next example I wanted to share was actually closer, much closer, and in your sector, which is BP. Now, I don't know how many of you realise, but they had a new CEO that started, Bernard Looney, in February this year. And let me just paint a picture of this sort of onboarding experience to becoming CEO. So he started in February, and less than 2 months after starting in that role, just off the back of announcing a very bold plan to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050, all hell breaks loose. So back in first quarter of 2019, BP made a profit of $3 billion. In the space of just 2 months, that went to a loss of $4.4 billion. So you're 2 months into your new leadership position and you're faced with a very, very difficult decision of needing to lay off 10,000 people, nearly 1 in 7 employees in BP. So how does a leader approach that? How do you find the inner strength and the courage to do that with grace and humility and humanity? Well, what Bernard did was he looked to his own childhood, which is often where we form, you know, our set of personal values and our own inner purpose. And he grew up in a large working class family, 1 of 5. He was the first in his family to go to university, and from university went to BP and made his way up through the organisation. And one of the things he learnt along the way is how to relate to people on a uniquely human level across all rank and file positions. So he drew on this strength and he started actually talking to the front line about what he needed to do to make this work. How was he going to keep the morale up when laying off so many people? And a really powerful example stuck with me, that he was, you know, someone from his offshore environment actually via Yammer said to him, not thinking he'd take it up, hey, we'd really love you to talk at one of our team meetings. And Bernard said, yeah, absolutely. And so this team of 20 people on an offshore oil rig were having this direct conversation, very intimate, about what was on their mind, the safety of their families back at home that they couldn't be with. One of the workers actually shared that he'd lost his mum through the experience, and Bernard actually sent a personal note of condolence to him after that. Another example was he got onto a conference call with a bunch of petrol station attendants in the UK. And they said, we're doing it really hard. We're considered essential service workers. We're at the front line and we're really finding it difficult to make ends meet with what we're paid. So he had that call, went back to his HR department and asked them to increase their salary through the period of COVID. So there's some just examples of how finding that human connection with the people will you know, not make it any easier for those 10,000 people that were let go, but just show that there's a real sense of humanity that endures through these difficult decisions. Last thing Bernard did was, when he came in, he felt very passionate about mental health, and he made that the key charity of BP. And what he did is he shared that the reason he chose that was because he himself had needed support on mental health through his life. Again, being really vulnerable, not the sort of thing that a tough new leader does, but sharing that he's had struggles in that area too. And clearly that charity was something that he could dial up and use the resources of that mental health partner through COVID to really support both himself, his employees, and the broader community. So some great examples there. In terms of what he did on the front line, I love these two examples. He started getting his teams to print respirators, high quality respirators for doctors and nurses who were serving at the front line over their 3D production printers, and repurpose those through COVID. The other thing he realised that he had a lot of surplus was fuel. So what did he do? He provided unlimited fuel vouchers to those volunteers at the front end that were distributing blood and medical supplies and food, and just said, here, have some free fuel to go about doing what you're doing at the front end. So some really powerful examples there. So, you know, there are difficult decisions that leaders having to make, but how do you do that in a way that continues the morale of the organisation and lets the organisational culture stay true as you go through it? I'd really encourage you can see a link on the page here. There's a great video, goes for about 4 minutes. Won't have time to do it today, but it really just gives you a sense of how BP actually came together through this crisis. And if anything, it probably strengthened their culture even further, albeit the difficult decisions that they had to make. The last example I want to share with you is another great example, but also another one that was difficult. And probably most of us have had an experience personally with this brand, Airbnb, described by its CEO, Brian Chesky, as a family culture. He describes everyone that works there as a family. And similarly to BP, he had to make some really difficult decisions. Their revenue has roughly halved, possibly more since COVID, and they've had to seek nearly $2 billion of capital raising to shore up their cash flow. And he also realised very early on that this was going to be a big problem, not something he could manage his way out without letting go some of his family. And he had to make a very, very difficult decision to reduce their workforce by 25%, some 2,000 people. So how do you do this when it feels like family? You know, how do you make these decisions? What do you do for those people to make that transition as easy as possible? So what he did was he got together with his management team and said, you know, let's think out of the box. What can we do to really make this as easy as possible, as least stressful for these people? So in addition to the obvious, generous severance and taking people's equity and allowing it to vest straight away, and extending health cover and giving people laptops, he did all that. But he said, what more can we do? And what he did was they had a great idea to take their internal recruitment team, the team dedicated to bringing on staff for Airbnb in a time of plenty, and to repurpose them as a placement team. So these people whose job was to hire people actually became to find jobs for the people that were leaving. And this group reached out to all of Silicon Valley, those tech companies who were booming, and made it their personal responsibility to find a job for each and every one of those people leaving. Brian himself actually reached out to CEOs and said, hey, can you take on some of our team? They're phenomenal. And I don't know what the exact numbers are, but when I last read it, they had placed over 1,000 of those Airbnb people, so more than half of them as of today. So I just think there's some really powerful examples in those four, and a powerful example that I'm going to pass back to Brett, because he's got a great example at Compass that I'd love him to share firsthand, that he shared with me. So Brett, tell us more about your example of purpose-led leadership.
Sure. Thanks, Jenny. I think thanks for sharing those stories. I think some amazing things, from kind of the small unique gestures to larger grand gestures, and I think navigating some difficult times as well. I think, look, this is more of it's one of those smaller unique examples that does demonstrate purpose within an organisation. So one of the things from a Compass perspective that we hold quite dearly to ourselves is about creating bonds and connections between people. And I think that this story really does reflect that behaviour within our teams. So during the height of the crisis, we were supporting a lot of the quarantine hotels with meals delivered in to support those people that were in isolation at the time. And there was this one instance where every day the team would go to pick up the trays, and the fruit was being returned untouched, essentially. So the team wrote a note through to the lady that was in the room and said, look, if you don't like fruit, is there something else that we can get for you? Her response was, it turned out that this lady was 80 plus years old, elderly lady, a little bit frail, and her response was, no, I love fruit, but I have such bad arthritis that I can't peel the oranges or cut the apples. And then from that day forward, this lady who received the note from our team went in early every single day, peeled the oranges and segmented it and popped it onto the tray for this lady, just to say, look, we're here, we're looking out for you. I'm seeing beyond the crisis and beyond the closed door of the hotel room to the person that's inside, and I'm here to help and create that bond and connection with you. And I thought that was just an amazing small example of that, creating bonds and connections between people.
Still gets to me, Brett, every time.
That's such a great share, and that probably leads us to the sharing session we're about to have. We've had lots of questions come through for you, Jennie, and I'll also give Brett an opportunity to ask a question. So, do you want to start us off, Brett?
Sure, happy to. So, look, I think you've talked a lot about some great examples and some great organisations and great leadership. I guess the question is once an organisation is on that purpose journey and have cemented their purpose, is it a case that they are always a purpose-led organisation, or is it something that requires kind of ongoing maintenance and care?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and let me start by saying sometimes when I go in and a leader will have this epiphany that they haven't got purpose and they need to do it. They'll come in and they'll say, how many weeks will it take for us to get that purpose stuff done? And the first thing I do is I have a tough conversation with that leader and say, that's kind of not how it works. It's a bit like continuous improvement in the manufacturing space. It is a never-ending journey. The minute you take your eye off it, it withers. So the best way I can describe it is a state of mind. It has to be constantly exercised. It needs to be front and center in your every decision making. It's not something you pull out at the end of a budget cycle and say, oh, how do we bring purpose into our strategic plan? If a leader is not saying, how does this decision help us get to our purpose, or how does it exercise us living our values, then it is not where it needs to be. So I think it is a constant battle, and it is not easy, right? These decisions are very difficult. So, I've seen great examples of purpose companies who I've admired. A new leader comes in, and within, months, the organisation's in a very different place and a different direction, sometimes not a good place. And I take them quietly off my list of example companies, or I use them as an example of what can happen when a change of leader occurs and that continuity of purpose doesn't carry on. So it's a great question, Brett. It is an ongoing muscle that you need to exercise, just like our bodies.
Yeah.
There's actually quite a lot of questions that are all very similar, so I'm going to summarise them for people. And they're really asking the very basic question of you, Jennie, which is, how do you help people find their purpose? And how do they find that, and then the range of questions around leadership and, purpose in life and how that feeds into leadership. So really, the majority of the questions really about people asking, how do we do it?
How do you do it? Yeah, great question. So, it is often inherent in companies who have been founded and still have their founders as leaders. So if I just think about Atlassian for 1 minute, when Mike and Scott founded the company, that big idea was what they founded the company on, and they're still the leaders, so it's still very obvious what that link is to why the company was started. Sometimes in bigger companies, that idea still exists, but it's been lost or forgotten. So one organisation, a very big Australian miner that I did this exercise for about 2 years ago, was over 160 years old, and its purpose was to deliver shareholder returns for you know, the shareholders. And that's not a purpose, that's an outcome. Making profits is an outcome of living your purpose. So how we found that purpose was we did what I best describe as an archaeological dig. We went back through 160 years of history and we said, why was the company founded? What was the big idea on which that company became? And what were the founders, what problem were they trying to solve? And then over the years, what sort of patterns and themes did we see in their history? Were they constantly pioneering new things? Were they, you know, constantly doing breakthroughs around technology? And through doing that archaeological dig, we were actually able to bring those themes up to the board and the leadership team and hold it up, nearly to say, this is what you're about over the last 160 years. And in doing that, we were able to kind of really draw out what their purpose was. It's not what it is, what it had been, and then just put some words around that, crystallize it, and then allow them to have that front and center going forward. So if I could draw you to a book, if you want to read more, Simon Sinek, who wrote Start With Why, actually wrote a great follow-up book called Find Your Why, because he had the exact same feedback from the audience, in that a lot of people said, it sounds like a great place to be, but how do I find my purpose? So Find Your Why is a book that you can read for an individual perspective on how to find, you know, your why, or it can be how you do it from an organizational point of view. And it really gives you a step-by-step guide to that kind of archaeological dig process, how to theme it and how to get it to a point where you can reflect that as a purpose statement. So, you know, sometimes we see in companies missions, you know, or vision statements. What I would say to you from a definitional point of view of purpose is it's an aspirational reason for being that is focused externally. It's not about you being the best or the strongest or having the most market share or making a financial sort of target. It's about your gift on society and humanity. So it's your contribution to the world, not what you're going to get out of it. So if you've got a mission statement in your company you're working for, or a purpose statement, throw it through that sort of criteria and you'll know whether I'd give it a green tick. But often I see purpose statements held up and I go, that's not a purpose statement. That's about you being the market leader. That's about you, not about what you're doing for the world. But you'll find plenty of, I'm going to give some tips at the end, Tara.
Stakeholders, they have stakeholder, they have profits, they have those things as their mission.
Correct. And I'm not by any means saying you don't need those other things. You obviously need targets and you need to know what your financial plans are, but they are outcomes of why you do what you do. The better you are at communicating your why and being passionate about that, guess what happens? You attract really engaged employees who deliver great customer experience, who tell other customers to come and join, and great profit returns come. So it's about how you go getting that money, you know, and driven by and inspired by that why.
There's actually a follow-on question here that directly relates to what you were just talking about, and it's asking about, as a resource and energy industry, the operators and the suppliers and contractors through the supply chain, everything is focused on production. So how do you find purpose in a very production-based industry?
Yeah, and look, I maybe use an analogy here. So a couple of years ago, I actually did a piece of work helping a law firm find their purpose. Not an exact analogy to this, but most of you, if you've ever had the privilege of using a lawyer, you will know that it is very dollar and cent. Every 6 minutes, 7 minutes, it's billable. So let me just try and draw some analogies here. So it's a big machine. It's a machine that's all about billing time, finely tuned to do that. And when we started this piece of work for the CEO, we did a bit of a global scan and said, has any law company ever done this before? Tried to transition from all about the bill to about the bigger, what they can do for the world? And the answer was no. So we went back to the CEO and said, batter up, you're the first. Are you still keen? Are you still feeling courageous? And she actually said, yeah, I am, because I think there's something here. And so we went through, they were a 156-year-old law firm, global law firm. So we went back through the history, and lo and behold, we found the most phenomenal, inspiring things about why they did what they did. They had the first female lawyer ever employed in Australia. They had made lots of firsts in breaking through legislation that was for the benefit of society. So when we started pulling these things through, they started going, did we do that? That was us. And this sense of pride started emerging about, actually, you know, yes, we build great money, but look at what that created. Look at what that did in the world. And in doing this, they suddenly discovered that actually there was a lot to be said about being proud of these things and actually being conscious of them and doing more of it. So my advice to you, if you know, are in a setting where you're in these heavy efficiency production things is, yes, that's your job. But if you were to, maybe I'll flip this another way, if you were to stop doing what you do, right, what would the world miss? What is it that doing that production enables in the world? And to start asking that question, because I suspect that if you stop doing that job, there'd be some pretty big human impacts to that. Whether it's, you know, we wouldn't have our smartphones because we wouldn't have the raw material to make them in, or, you know, we wouldn't be able to drive our cars or whatever it is. But it's getting to that, what is the end result or contribution of the thing that you do? Hopefully that helps, that question. Thanks for that. It's a great question.
It sure does. And just to comment on that, I think the industry itself has been on that journey, particularly in the last 10 years, from a community engagement perspective, to you know, talk to Australians about, well, what the contribution is as a wider industry. So not just at an organisational level or is it a people level. I feel like the whole industry, whether it be mining, whether it be oil and gas, or whether it be, you know, services, has been been on that journey.
Absolutely. And look, this helps you articulate your social license to operate, because it's easy to be on either side of this spectrum. You know, I'm all about going green, and, you know, it's all about being mining. I actually think it's not a paradox. It's about a transition. And actually what this does is it helps both sides see the empathy in the position and understand the contribution. And when we unite on the contribution, we actually then go, actually, we need that. And that's important to me, and I understand where you're going. So it's actually about bringing humans from both sides into the discussion so we can have a more balanced view. And I think, again, if you look at BP and Bernard Looney, you know, when he came out in February and said, you know, we're gonna go to zero emissions by 2050, you'll notice that 6 oil and gas companies followed within a few months. But he was first. He had the, you know, kahunas, to use an Australian term, to actually go and say that first, even though it would be uncomfortable for shareholders, even though it would be uncomfortable. And, you know, those people that work in that company were then inspired by that bigger idea.
Yes, so fair to say, Jenny, as well, that as we kind of look, particularly if we look in the resources industry as well, as we start to see the change of demographic and the change of, so the new millennials have been coming through into the mining workforce, so they have a different focus on what's important to them, and things like, it could be the outcomes around sustainability or community involvement, but probably more broadly, the purpose piece that sits behind that is actually what's going to attract people to the industry and to individual organisations. So it's not just a decision-making tool, it's potentially kind of the employee value proposition and an employee attraction tool as well. Is that fair to say? And have you seen examples of that?
Absolutely. So if you think about attracting talent, or let me share a personal story. You know, our purpose at EY is building a better working world, and we employ roughly, I think it's 700 graduates a year in the Melbourne office. So it's a lot of new talent coming into our organisation. And I recall about a year ago, I thought I was interviewing the graduate. And anyway, she turned it on the head and she said, okay, you've got your purpose on the wall, building a better working world. Give me 3 examples where you've done that in the last 2 weeks. Now, she obviously picked the right person to ask that question to, but I wondered whether all our other partners that work in tax or whether in insurance would have been able to answer that with the kind of, you know, depth and content that she was looking for. And she was really serious. She was saying, prove it to me that that's what you're doing. How are you doing it? Where are you doing it? Who are you doing it to? Because I want to know that I'm joining someone that actually doesn't just put it up on the wall, but actually does it. And I think that's the rub, right? Not that you say you do it, but you do it is what they're looking for. And actually, I find that millennials are attracted to the challenge of change. So if you think about BP, you know, where traditionally you might have had some difficulty bringing talent in, if the bold, audacious goal is transitioning from this to this, that's actually a really interesting problem to solve. And millennials want to be part of change. So I think there's this huge opportunity in your sector, in the sector, to really put that challenge to the millennials and say, how can you help us make these transitions? And I think you will attract your best and brightest to those big problems. So yeah, I think turn it around and make that challenge a collective challenge to the people you're bringing in.
That's actually a perfect segue to one of the questions we've got when you just said turning it around, because there's a question that stemmed from your point around the two-way feedback. So the question says, apart from the surveys and the pulse, to be able to get feedback, can you give us some examples of where you've seen that two-way feedback work really well?
Yeah, look, many. One that really stuck in my mind is, so how's this? I had a tobacco company approach and say, we want to find a purpose. You know, my own moral filters going through this. And I said, tell me more. And they said, well, we don't believe that we can maintain our social license to operate going forward. You know, tobacco kills people, so where's the goodness in society? So I said, okay, so is the reason you want to do this to reinvent yourself as something else? And he said yes. And I said, well, I'm up for that, because you know, if we leave all these organizations who have questionable moral products and no one helps them, then there's a whole lot of people impacted by that decision. And if you understand where tobacco is grown, it is grown in third world countries with people not even at the poverty line. So them going out of business means that whole ecosystem and those communities go under. So we took on that project, and what we did was we came up with an idea to transition the crops to medical marijuana. And that company now is one of the most profitable medical marijuana companies. Those communities are still actively harvesting, just a different crop. There's no tobacco coming out of it. And in fact, they're making more profit now and more money flowing back to those farmers. So to answer your question, what we did early on is we asked the farmers, you know, questions. Could we harvest these sorts of things? Would they have consequences? What do you think we could harvest that would, you know, be profitable or work on the land? And the farmers were actually the ones who gave us a lot of the inspiration and ideas to make that pivot. So from a tobacco company, in 3 years to one of the world's leading medical marijuana companies. That's purpose-led transformation in a box. Unbelievable transformation. Yeah, incredible.
We've only got time for one more of the questions that are here, but it's a bit of a doozy. It's a bit of a challenge, because you talked about the morale of an organisation, how the purpose assists with that when you're going through tough times. This person said that everyone they talk to at the moment in their company or in their friendship groups, just everyone's flat. How do you support the morale of an organisation through purpose-led, you know, leadership and support and culture when everyone at the moment is just so flat?
Yeah. Well, look, I kind of come back to my opening comments that, you know, when we are feeling flat, we look to meaning. It's right back to the first slide I did. And in that meaning, we find, you know, the power and the strength to go, you know, that servant leadership, if I could call it that. So when we're feeling flat, I think the best thing you can do is turn your mind to what is the bigger thing we can do for others that will actually help to motivate us and get us out of that flatness. So we can dwell in our bubble and say, it's not good, it's all terrible. But if we actually say, what could the gift of this organisation, its capabilities and skill do externally, that's actually a really motivating force. And that's why this why works, because when we actually get off our, you know, get off our sort of comfort zone and say, what can I do for others? And, you know, anyone who's done volunteering will know the satisfaction you get in doing so. There's something that comes back at you when you do good. And that's really what that why does. So I would say, go and find out what that thing is, go and think about or ask what the world wants of you, what you can do to help, and make that the fuel for going forward and your inspiration. Everyone can do it. If I can get a tobacco company to go into medical, trust me, just remember that example. If they can do it.
Well, just talking about giving, you wanted to give some resources to our participants today. And so I'm just going to share my screen so that people can see. I'm hoping that's coming up on the screen now.
Perfect.
Jenny, do you mind sharing these resources so that people can take more away from all the amazing insights you've shared with us?
Yeah, Tara, you're more than welcome to PDF this pack and just pop it up. But 3 I wanted to mention that might be really helpful. And this sort of not-for-profit group, Just Capital, it's an American company, but what they do, and it stands for as in justice, they set up a website to track the top 100 most just or purpose-led companies, if you like, in America. And what they've done is they've got a tracker, and this tracker actually says what are the best moves that they're making as purpose-led companies across all functional dimensions of an organisation. So from a HR lens, from a procurement lens, from a customer lens, and you can sort on this. So if you're running HR in your organisation, you can go on and see the top 100 things that these companies have done, broken down, and takes you straight to their press release or their announcement. So it's a phenomenal resource. I go there if I'm ever feeling down to get a little bit more inspiration. So that's one. The second one is we have a dedicated site in EY for all things purpose. We do constant research with Harvard Business School and Oxford SAED on this topic. So if you want to read that research, you can get it there. And then last but not least, as you can probably imagine, I blog a lot and write a lot of articles on this topic. So just link into me, and probably every week there'll be something that'll hopefully give you a little nugget of inspiration in an ongoing sense. And, you know, wish everyone the best on their journey to move into that first category. It works.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. We could have kept going, I'm sure, for another hour, and there was some really fantastic questions. So really want to start by thanking you, Jenny, for sharing your expertise and insights and you know, it's fair to say inspiration as well for all the people that were listening today and people that listen to the recording moving forward. Thank you so much. And thank you, Brett, for you know, getting us started today and introducing Jenny to our participants today. It's absolutely wonderful. We are posting the recordings for these webinars on the AMA website a day or two after for you to watch again or to share with your teams that weren't able to make the webinar live. So please keep an eye out for the recording of it. Just want to thank Jenny again so much for her time today. Thank you, Brett. I'm going to close the webinar now. Good afternoon, everyone, and please take care.
Thanks,
guys. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.